There are press conferences in professional sports that are formalities. Players sit down. They answer questions. They say the right things. The cameras roll. The quotes are filed. Everyone goes home. Nothing changes. And then there are press conferences that stop everything. The room was already tense when Shohei Ohtani walked in. The story had been building for hours, since the moment the fifth incorrect call was officially confirmed, since MLB's statement landed in every newsroom in America simultaneously, since the word spread through baseball like a current through water that something had happened that the sport had never quite dealt with before. An umpire fired. Compensation demanded. A player's name attached to something that the game's leadership was treating not as a controversy but as a crisis. Ohtani sat down. The cameras clicked. The room settled. And then a reporter asked the question that everyone in that room had traveled there specifically to ask. About the accusations. About what had been alleged. About whether Ohtani believed that what happened on that field, 5 calls, 5 moments where the game's most scrutinized player was placed at a disadvantage by the person whose entire job was impartiality, was intentional. Ohtani was quiet for a moment. And then he said it. If that's true, if what is being said is true, I am never pitching again. The room did not react immediately. It took a breath first. The kind of collective pause that happens when something is said that everyone present understands, in the same instant, will be repeated for years. Because Shohei Ohtani does not say things like that. He does not make dramatic statements. He does not use press conferences as theaters for emotion. He speaks carefully, measures his words, and says precisely what he means. Which means he meant precisely what he said. And the baseball world, in the silence that followed, began to understand that what had started as a story about an umpire had become something much larger, a story about trust, about integrity, and about what happens when the sport's greatest player looks at the institution he has dedicated his life to and says, plainly, that he is not sure he can continue if what he is hearing is true. Before the accusations and the firings and the press conference that shook the sport, there were 5 moments on a baseball field. 5 calls. 5 decisions made in real time by an umpire whose authority on that field, in those moments, was absolute. Balls called strikes. A checked swing ruled a full swing. A timing play adjudicated in a way that the replay system later confirmed was incorrect, not borderline, not the kind of close call that reasonable people can disagree about, but incorrect in the clear and measurable way that MLB's expanded replay and ball tracking technology now makes impossible to dispute. 5 calls. Against the same player. In the same game. Individually, incorrect calls are not news. Baseball has always had them. The human element of umpiring, the margin of error built into a system where split-second decisions are made by people standing 60 feet from a pitch traveling 95 miles an hour, has been part of the sport's texture for over a century. Fans argue about calls. Managers get ejected over calls. Players express frustration through looks and body language calibrated carefully enough to communicate disagreement without crossing the line into ejection territory. But 5 incorrect calls against the same player, in the same game, confirmed by technology that removes all ambiguity from the assessment, that is a different kind of story. That is the kind of pattern that the people responsible for the integrity of professional baseball cannot look at and conclude, with any honesty, is simply the accumulation of ordinary human error. MLB's investigation, conducted in the days following the game, reached its conclusion with a speed that itself communicated something. This was not a months-long review. This was not a process designed to produce ambiguity. The evidence was reviewed. The conclusion was reached. And the umpire was fired. The demand for compensation, directed at the team whose game had been affected by the 5 incorrect calls, came simultaneously. And it was the compensation demand, more than the firing itself, that told the baseball world how seriously MLB was treating what it had found. You demand compensation when you believe harm was done. You demand compensation when the evidence of that harm is clear enough to make the demand defensible. MLB believed the harm was clear enough. The firing alone would have been significant. The compensation demand would have sustained the story for weeks. But it was the accusation, the specific, named, public accusation made by a figure inside the game, that turned a serious story into a crisis. The statement did not come through a lawyer. It did not come in the careful language of a formal complaint filed with baseball's grievance mechanisms. It came the way the most combustible statements in professional sports always come, directly, publicly, with the kind of specificity that makes it impossible for the subject of the accusation to simply wait for it to go away. The umpire intentionally framed me and Shohei. Those words landed in the baseball world the way a stone lands in still water, with an immediate impact at the point of entry and ring spreading outward in every direction that could not be recalled once they had begun to move. The word, intentionally, was the stone. Everything else was the water. Because there is an enormous difference between an umpire who makes mistakes, even multiple mistakes, even mistakes that display a troubling pattern, and an umpire who makes mistakes with purpose. The first is a human failing. It is correctable, it is understandable, and while it may justify removal from officiating duties, it does not shake the foundations of the sport. The second is something else entirely. The second is the kind of allegation that forces everyone connected to professional baseball to ask a question that the sport has spent its entire modern history working very hard not to have to ask. What if it wasn't a mistake? That question, once asked publicly by a named individual with standing in the game, cannot be unasked. It moves through the baseball world and demands an answer. Not eventually. Not through the slow machinery of institutional review. It demands an answer immediately, in the press conferences and the clubhouses and the broadcast booths where the sport's daily conversation happens. And it was that question, hanging unanswered in the air of that press conference room, that Ohtani walked into when he sat down in front of the cameras. To understand why Ohtani's statement landed with the force that it did, you have to understand what pitching means to him. Not tactically. Not professionally. What it means to him personally, at the level where sport and identity become the same thing. Ohtani has been pitching since before he could fully articulate why he loved it. The mechanics of it, the chess match between pitcher and hitter, the way a well-executed sequence of pitches can dismantle a lineup with an intelligence that pure physical power cannot replicate, these things have been part of how Ohtani understands himself as a baseball player since his earliest years in the game. His journey as a pitcher has not been without difficulty. The injuries that threatened his two-way career. The surgeries. The rehabilitation processes that demanded patience from a player who had never been given strong reasons to be patient about his physical ability. Through all of it, pitching remained the thing he came back to. The thing he rebuilt toward. The thing that, alongside his hitting, made him not just a great player but a genuinely unprecedented one. When Ohtani said, "I am never pitching again," if that's true, he was not making a tactical statement about his career plans. He was reaching for the most extreme expression of how seriously he takes the integrity of the competition that pitching requires. He was saying that pitching, for him, is built on a foundation of trust. Trust that the person calling balls and strikes is doing so honestly. Trust that the framework of the game, the structure within which his ability operates and is evaluated, is not being manipulated by the person entrusted with its most basic function. If that trust is gone, if the accusation is true, then pitching, for Ohtani, becomes something different from what it has always been for him. It becomes a performance conducted inside a system that may be rigged. And a man who has devoted his life to excellence inside a fair competition cannot simply absorb that possibility and continue as though nothing has changed. That is what his statement meant. Not a threat. Not a negotiating position. A declaration of what the sport's integrity means to him personally, and how much he needs it to be real. The response to Ohtani's statement was immediate, widespread, and deeply divided. There were those who heard his words and understood them as the only honest response available to a player in his position. A man of Ohtani's character, a man whose entire public and private identity is built around the principle that excellence requires fairness, that preparation only matters inside a competition whose results are determined by performance rather than by the decisions of compromised officials, could not have said anything less. His statement was not an overreaction. It was a precise expression of what the accusation, if true, would mean for someone who has given everything to the game on the assumption that the game was giving him an honest competition in return. There were also those who urged caution. Who noted that an accusation, even a specific and public one, is not a verdict. Who pointed out that the investigation MLB conducted, as serious as its conclusions appeared, had not yet produced a full public accounting of the evidence. Who argued that Ohtani's statement, however emotionally authentic, risked escalating a situation that still contained significant factual uncertainty. Both of these responses were honest. Both came from people who cared about the sport and about what the story meant for it. But neither of them fully captured what the statement actually did to the baseball world in the hours and days that followed. What it did was force a reckoning. Not with the specific facts of the accusation, those would be examined and debated through the appropriate channels. But with the larger question that the accusation raised about the sport's relationship with the integrity it has always claimed as one of its foundational values. Baseball has survived scandals before. It has survived betting controversies and substance controversies and the long, difficult reckoning with its own history that the sport is still navigating. It has survived because, at each crisis point, the people responsible for the game made decisions that communicated, imperfectly, sometimes belatedly, but eventually, that the integrity of the competition was not negotiable. The firing of the umpire. The demand for compensation. These were decisions that communicated exactly that. And Ohtani's statement, for all its emotional weight, was ultimately making the same point from the other direction, from the perspective of the player whose trust in the competition is the thing that the competition most needs to deserve. The details that emerged from MLB's investigation in the days following the firings painted a picture that was troubling in its specificity. The 5 incorrect calls were not distributed randomly across the game. They were concentrated in moments of competitive significance, at-bat counts where a correct call would have extended Ohtani's opportunity at the plate, pitching sequences where the called strikes altered the psychological dynamic between Ohtani on the mound and the hitters he was facing. The pattern, examined through the lens of ball tracking data that now provides millimeter-level accuracy on pitch location, was not consistent with ordinary human error variance. Ordinary human error is distributed across games, across players, across competitive situations without meaningful pattern. What the data showed was something different, a clustering of incorrect decisions at moments where their impact on Ohtani specifically would be maximized. This is what MLB's investigators found. This is what drove the decision to move as quickly as it did. And this is what gave the accusation its teeth, because the pattern the accusers described was consistent with what the technology independently confirmed. What the investigation could not definitively establish, what no investigation of this kind can establish without direct evidence of intent, was the why. The mechanics of the 5 calls were documented. The impact on the game was calculable. The departure from the umpire's own historical accuracy rates was measurable. But intent lives in a place that ball tracking data cannot reach. And without that evidence, the accusation remained exactly what it was, a serious, specific, credible allegation, supported by circumstantial evidence that demanded to be taken seriously, but not yet a proven fact. That distinction matters. It mattered to the people defending the accused. It mattered to the lawyers on every side of the situation. And it mattered, most importantly, to the process that baseball now had to conduct publicly, under the scrutiny of a sport that was watching every step. Ohtani left the press conference the way he arrived. Quietly. Without the kind of dramatic exit that his words might have suggested was coming. He answered the follow-up questions that came after the statement with the same careful specificity that characterizes everything he says publicly. He did not expand the statement beyond what he had already said. He did not walk it back. He said what he meant. And then he stopped talking and let the words stand on their own. In the days that followed, the baseball world did what it always does with things that matter: it argued, it analyzed, it generated opinions in every direction simultaneously. Broadcasters and former players and analysts and fans all processed the statement through their own frameworks and reached their own conclusions about what it meant and what it should mean. But beneath all of that, beneath the arguments and the hot takes and the institutional responses and the legal maneuvering that the situation was already beginning to generate, something quieter was happening. Players across the league were talking to each other. In clubhouses and training facilities and the informal spaces where professional athletes speak honestly with one another away from cameras and recorders. And what they were saying, by the accounts of those who were part of those conversations, was that Ohtani's statement had named something that many of them had felt at various points in their careers but had never heard expressed so directly by someone with his standing in the sport. The need for the competition to be real. The need for the framework, the umpires, the rules, the officiating structure within which all of them had built their careers, to be trustworthy. Not perfect. Not infallible. But trustworthy. Honest in its intentions even when imperfect in its execution. That is what Ohtani was defending when he said what he said. Not his statistics. Not his contract. Not his reputation or his legacy or any of the external things that the size of his fame makes it easy to assume are what he cares about most. He was defending the game. The actual game, the competition conducted honestly between people who have given everything to prepare for it, that he fell in love with long before anyone outside Japan knew his name. And if that game is not what he has always believed it to be, then he will not pitch inside it. That is not a threat. That is a love letter to baseball's integrity, written in the most direct language available to a man who does not speak dramatically unless the moment demands it. The moment demanded it. And baseball, the entire sport, its leadership and its players and its fans, now has to decide what it will do to deserve the trust that statement revealed he had always placed in it.